The thing about being buried alive is that the darkness either breaks you or it builds you into something your captors never prepared for. Dorothea William made one fatal mistake when she sealed that basement door. She left Gracie a candle stub, 2 sheets of paper, and just enough fury to fill them both. The sound began without warning. Not a slam. Not a lock clicking into place. Something worse. A low mechanical hiss, the rhythmic clink of iron against iron, the unmistakable finality of a welding torch burning a seam that would never open again. Gracie Williams sat on the edge of a thin cot in the dark of the vault beneath the wine cellar, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she listened. She listened the way a person listens when there is nothing else left to do. The sound lasted 4 minutes. She counted. When it stopped, the silence that replaced it was total. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a room that had been engineered never to carry a voice out of it. Sound-proofed walls, stone floor, no window, no crack of grey sky, no elm tree, nothing to watch but her own hands in the dark, and even those she could barely see. Above her, the William estate was alive. She felt it the way she always felt it. Through the floor, through the walls, through the faint tremor of carriage wheels on the drive, the muffled vibration of boot heels crossing the grand entrance hall. Somewhere above her head, candles burned in silver holders. Somewhere above her head, a woman in a gown she had once worn was accepting invitations with her name crossed out of them. The house moved on, as houses do. As if Gracie William had never existed inside it at all. She had. Once. Her father, Sir Thomas William, had built this estate with the particular tenderness of a man who wanted his daughter to feel she owned every room she entered. He had filled the library with books she chose herself. He had argued with the architect until the morning room windows faced east, because Gracie loved the early light. He had laughed loudly and without apology, and the sound of it had been the loudest thing in any room he entered. She had been expected at supper, she had been expected everywhere. But Sir Thomas William had drowned, accidentally they said, and after the funeral Burmese, not immediately, not dramatically, but with the slow and deliberate patience of someone who had planned it long before the mourning clothes were folded away. Everything changed. The books were rearranged. Her portrait was moved to a back corridor, then removed entirely. Her dresses for evening company disappeared from the wardrobe. Her name stopped appearing on invitations. The staff she had known for years were replaced, one by people with quiet eyes who did not speak unless spoken to and never looked at her directly. "You are so delicate," Dorothea had said, her fingers resting on Gracie's wrist with the lightness of a warning. "The physician has advised rest. Society exhausts a sensitive constitution. I shall tell callers, you are traveling. It is better for you. It is better this way. It is better this way." Those 5 words had built the vault before the vault existed. First, Gracie had been confined to the upper floors, then to a single room, then the renovations began. Renovations that required her relocation to the wine cellar's antechamber only temporarily, only while the work was completed. The work was never completed. The door was never reopened. And 3 weeks ago, Dorothea had stopped visiting entirely, and the maid who brought food each morning had begun sliding the tray through a narrow slot in the lower frame without speaking, without looking, as if feeding an animal she preferred not to see. Gracie had understood then that she was not being hidden. She was being erased. She rose from the cot and crossed to the small table she had pushed beneath the air duct, the one narrow seam in the vault's construction that let in a thread of cold and the faintest whisper of the world above. A stub of candle sat there. 2 sheets of paper, a glass shard she had wrapped in torn linen to protect her fingers, and a small wound on the pad of her left index finger that had not yet fully closed. She sat down, she dipped the tip of the shard, and she began to write the only way she had left to write, slowly, carefully, in the ink her own body had made. Writing had become the last thing Dorothea could not take from her. It required no candle if she memorized the shape of each letter. It required no ink if she was willing to bleed for it. She had written letters no one would ever read, letters to her father before she understood what her father had done, letters to a version of herself who lived in a cottage by the sea with mud on her boots and no one telling her to be quiet, letters to an unnamed someone, a person she had invented out of longing, who might understand what it meant to be alive inside a room that had been told you were not there. Tonight, she wrote with particular care, because tonight she had a plan. To whoever finds these words, she began, then paused, her jaw tightening against the emotion that always rose when she wrote the opening. I am not mad. I am not at the seaside. I am not recovering from an ailment of the nerves. I am Gracie William, daughter of Sir Thomas William of the William estate in Stirling. I am being held beneath my own home by my stepmother, Dorothea William. If you are reading this, then you are the only person outside these walls who knows I am still alive. Her hand did not tremble. She had written enough letters now that the trembling had run out. There is a difference between being locked away and being unmade. Dorothea does not want me imprisoned. She wants me not to exist. I do not know yet which of those is worse, but I know this. If someone does not come soon, I will find out. She folded the letter. Then she folded it again until it was no larger than a coin. She had watched through the vent for 3 days, timing the schedule of the carriage yard above. The Duke of Stirling's personal carriage, which had been sent to William Estate for a wheel repair, was being returned at dawn. She had heard the coachman's voice. She had heard the address called out. She knew that carriage, if she could reach it through the coal passage, if she could wedge the letter into the hollow of the wheel brace she had heard the Smiths arguing about. It was not a plan. It was a prayer with a deadline. She moved through the dark without a candle, one hand trailing the wall, until her fingers found the low iron grate of the coal passage. She pulled it open. She crawled. Across the city, in the high-ceilinged study of Stirling House, Charles Edward, Duke of Stirling, stood at his window with the look of a man who had forgotten how to want anything. He was not old, he was not cold, he was simply armored in the way that men who have survived several kinds of loss tend to armor themselves, completely and from the inside out. His title was respected, his word was law in 4 counties, he was invited to every significant gathering in the season and attended the ones that required his presence with the discipline of a man who understood duty and the restraint of one who no longer confused it with living. He had loved a woman once, before the title, before the weight of it. The memory lived in him the way old injuries live, quiet until the weather changed. The carriage smith arrived at 9:30 in the morning, cap in hand, with mud on his boots, and an expression that suggested he had debated the decision to come at all. He set a scrap of linen on the study desk without explanation. Then he stepped back and waited. Charles crossed to the desk. He looked at the linen. The writing was small and dark, too dark and too brown for ink. His jaw set. He picked it up. He read it standing, without sitting down, without calling for anyone, without moving at all except for the slow, deliberate tightening of his right hand against the edge of the desk. He read it once. Then he read it again. I am Gracie William. I am still alive. The room seemed to close around him, not with dread, with something older and more specific than dread. recognition. The feeling of a man who has spent years refusing to look directly at something finally being forced to turn his head.
He had known Sir Thomas? Not well. Well enough. A man of loud laughter and fierce pride in a daughter he had called bright as morning. Charles had heard the rumours after Thomas's death, the quiet removal of the daughter from public life, the whispers of hereditary instability, the polite fiction of an asylum in the Americas. He had not investigated. He had told himself it was not his concern. He had told himself a great many things. He folded the letter. He turned to the carriage smith. He opened his mouth to speak, and the window behind the man exploded inward. The shot was silent. The body was not. Charles stood in the sudden cold of the shattered window, the dead man at his feet, and the sound of boots already crossing the entrance hall below, too fast, too organized, too ready to have arrived by coincidence. Yet he looked down at the letter still in his hand, then at the body, then at the door. Someone had known the letter would come. Someone had waited for him to read it. And now a man was dead in his study, and the only thing that stood between Charles Edward and a murder charge was a scrap of linen written in a woman's blood. He had perhaps 4 minutes before the constable reached the study door. He moved. Welcome back, my dear romantics. Before we enter tonight's tale of whispered vows and stolen glances, be sure you're subscribed, leave a like, and tell me where you're listening from. I love seeing our historical romance family spread across the world. Every comment and bit of support keeps these stories of scandal, duty, and desire alive. So settle in, let the world fade away. Now let us begin.
The Sterling estate did not welcome the morning so much as it endured it. Dawn came in through tall windows the colour of old pewter, laying thin strips of grey light across the study floor, across the mahogany desk, across the hands of Charles Edward, Duke of Sterling, who had not slept. He stood at the window with a glass of brandy he had not drunk, staring out at the grounds where the mist still clung to the iron fence posts like something that did not yet know it was time to dissolve. He was 31 years old and bore the particular stillness of a man who had trained himself not to want things. It was not coldness. Those who mistook it for coldness did not know what it had cost him to get there. His jaw was sharp, his shoulders squared beneath his dark coat.
And his eyes, the colour of storm-bruised sky, moved over the grounds with the slow, systematic awareness of a man who was always watching for the thing he did not want to find. The carriage from the William estate had been delivered at 8:30. He had thought nothing of it. The wheel brace had been sent for repair a fortnight ago. Charles had not given the carriage or its origin a second thought, until the carriage smith arrived at the study door with his hat in both hands, and something in his expression that looked very much like the particular fear of a man carrying something he did not understand. "Your Grace," the man had said. He set the scrap of linen on the edge of the desk and stepped back, as though the distance between himself and the thing might offer protection. It was folded inside the wheel housing.
Packed in tight, deliberate-like. I near missed it entirely. Charles had crossed to the desk. He had looked at the linen without touching it. The writing was small, dark at the edges where it had dried to rust, and unmistakably written in blood. Not the careless blood of an accident. The precise, controlled strokes of someone who had known exactly what they were doing and had chosen each word with the gravity of a person who understood they might only have one chance to be heard. He picked it up. He read it standing, without the luxury of sitting down, without calling for anyone, without moving at all except for the slow and terrible tightening of something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. The clenching sensation of a man who has tried very hard to feel nothing and has abruptly failed. I am not mad. I am not at the seaside. I am Gracie William, daughter of Sir Thomas William, and I am being held beneath my own home. If you are reading this, you are the only person outside these walls who knows I am still alive. Please, do not let her erase me. The room held its breath around him. Charles had known Sir Thomas William once, not intimately, but with the warmth of men who respected each other across a crowded room. A man of loud laughter and deep loyalty, and a daughter he had spoken of the way men speak of things they consider sacred. He had called her bright as morning once, and Charles had filed the phrase away without knowing why. He had heard the rumours after Thomas's drowning, the delicate constitution, the private asylum, the gentle tragedy of hereditary madness. He had not investigated, he had not allowed himself to. But he was beginning to understand why someone needed him not to. He turned to the carriage smith to ask when, exactly, the letter had been found and whether the man had spoken of it to anyone. The window exploded inward, not with sound, with consequence. The glass came apart in a single sheet and the carriage smith dropped without a word, without a gasp, without the courtesy of a dramatic collapse. He simply ceased to be standing. The blood reached Charles's boot before the man had fully hit the floor, and Charles was already moving, not away but low, pressing his back to the side of the desk, one hand braced against the wood, the letter still in his other fist. Silence. Then rising through the silence, the sound of boots in the entrance hall. Not one pair. Several. Moving with the coordinated purpose of men who had known precisely when to arrive. Charles remained still for 3 counted seconds. The constable who pushed through the study door was young, neat, and careful. The kind of careful that comes not from natural caution, but from instruction. His eyes moved directly to the body on the floor, then to Charles, then to the shattered window. And his expression did not change at all. It was the expression of a man confirming something he already knew. "Your Grace," he said, "we received a report of a disturbance." The report had been sent before the window broke. Charles understood this with the absolute clarity of a man whose mind, under pressure, did not scatter, but narrowed to a single bright point. The shot, the arrival, the careful eyes, this was not response, this was staging. Someone had wanted a dead man on his study floor and a letter in his hand, and they had arranged both with the patience of a chess player who had been planning the move for weeks. He looked at the constable, he looked at the body, he looked at the letter, still folded in his fist. "A terrible accident," Charles said, and his voice came out level and untroubled, the voice of a man who wore his title like armor and had just remembered what it was for. "The window latch has been failing. I have meaning to have it seen to." The poor man was struck by the glass as it gave way. The constable's eyes moved again to the body, to the single clean wound in the man's back, to the angle of the shattered glass, which, if one thought about it, was entirely inconsistent with a failed latch. He said nothing. Charles held his gaze and did not flinch. But it took 40 minutes to clear the room, 40 minutes of polite questions and carefully imprecise answers, of watching the constable note things down in his book, with the deliberate slowness of a man deciding how much to record. When they finally left, the body removed, the statements taken, the constable's last glance at the door, carrying the particular weight of a warning not spoken aloud, Charles stood alone in the wreckage of his study and allowed himself exactly one full breath of something that was not composure. Then he unfolded the letter. He read it again, slower this time. He read the line, "Do not let her erase me. and felt it land somewhere behind his sternum, like a key turning in a lock he had not known was there. Gracie William was alive. She was beneath her own estate. And someone with very long reach and very cold patience had just made absolutely certain that the Duke of Stirling could not report what he knew without placing himself at the centre of a murder inquiry. He folded the letter. He placed it inside his coat, against his chest, where the warmth of his body would keep it. He crossed to his writing desk. He sat. And in the quiet ruins of his study, with the morning light coming cold through the broken window, he began to plan. The vault had no clock. This, Gracie had come to understand, was not an oversight. Dorothea William did nothing by oversight. The removal of time was a weapon, precise, invisible, and more corrosive than chains. Without a clock, without daylight, without the sound of bells, or the rhythm of meals at predictable hours, the mind lost its grip on sequence. Hours became interchangeable. Days blurred at the edges. Gracie had begun counting her heartbeats to mark the time, and even that had started to feel uncertain. She was seated on the edge of the cot when the door opened. Not the sealed door. That door was iron and welded shut and had not moved since the night Dorothea had stood on the other side of it and said, very quietly, "This is for your own protection, darling," before the torch's hiss had begun. There was a second entrance, a service hatch in the far wall, low and narrow, accessible only from the corridor behind the wine racks. It was through this hatch that the food tray came each morning, slid through without eye contact by the maid, whose footsteps Gracie had learned to identify by sound alone. Today the footsteps were different, measured, unhurried. The deliberate rhythm of a woman who moved through every room as though she owned it, which Dorothea William did and always had. The hatch opened. Dorothea did not crouch. She simply lowered herself with the practiced elegance of a woman who had decided that no circumstance required her to abandon grace. And she stepped into the vault, as though entering a drawing room she found slightly beneath her standards. She wore deep green silk. Her hair was immaculate. She carried a small tray, a single glass of wine, deep red, and a folded letter sealed with dark wax. Gracie did not rise. She was 22 years old and had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes. The mother she had never known, the one Dorothea never mentioned. And in the 6 weeks since her imprisonment she had lost weight she could not afford to lose, but she had not lost the particular quality that had always made Dorothea's jaw tighten when she looked at her. Call it defiance, call it the refusal to be diminished. It lived in the set of Gracie's shoulders and the steadiness of her dark gaze, and it had not gone anywhere. "You look thin," Dorothea said, with the sympathy of a woman commenting on the weather. "You look well," Gracie said. "Guilt agrees with you." Dorothea set the tray on the small table. "I brought your medicine. The physician says it will calm the episodes." There were no episodes. There had never been episodes. This too was a weapon. The slow, patient construction of a medical history that existed only in Dorothea's correspondence and the mouths of physicians on her payroll. If Gracie was ever found, there would be a paper trail. There would be diagnosis and prognosis and concerned professional signatures. There would be nothing that looked like imprisonment and everything that looked like care. "I don't want it," Gracie said. "Gracie." Dorothea's voice softened in the way it always softened, not with warmth, but with the particular texture of patience being performed. "The wine will help you sleep. You need sleep, and—" She lifted the folded letter. "I have brought you something. A reply." Gracie's eyes moved to the letter before she could stop them. She had sent the blood letter 2 weeks ago, or what she believed was 2 weeks, in this place, without clocks. She had crawled through the coal passage in the dark. had felt her way to the carriage axle by touch alone. Some had folded the linen with shaking hands and wedged it into the wheel housing, and then pressed herself flat against the stone floor as the coachman's boots passed within 2 feet of her face. She had believed in the cold and terrified clarity of that moment that she was doing the bravest thing she had ever done. The reply had not come when she expected it. Then it had arrived. Through the food hatch, tucked beneath the breakfast tray, as though it were nothing, as though the distance between her letter and this response had required no effort at all on anyone's part. The ease of it should have warned her. She had not let herself be warned. She took the letter now. She broke the seal. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature was not C. Edward, Duke of Stirling, Duke of Wow.
She read it once and felt the words like cold water against her skin. I do not know what game you are playing. I have not corresponded with you. I have no knowledge of any William daughter, nor any interest in acquiring one. Do not contact me again. The paper was fine. The ink was perfect. The dismissal was absolute. Gracie sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She read it 3 more times, each time searching for something she might have misread, some cadence in the phrasing that might soften it, some evidence of a man writing under duress rather than with contempt. She found nothing. The words were what they were. "Drink your medicine," Dorothea said, gently from the corner. "It will help." Gracie drank the wine. She was not certain, later, exactly when the edges of things began to soften, when the lamp's light started to feel warmer than it should, when the stone walls seemed to breathe, when the letter in her hand began to waver as though she were reading it through water. She held on to the words even as her grip on them loosened. She held on to the contempt in them, the cold finality, and tried to make herself believe they were real. What she could not know, what she would not know for weeks, was that the ink in which that letter was written had been prepared with extraordinary care, not for elegance, for chemistry, a substance extracted from a plant that grew in the warmer southern territories, introduced in trace amounts into the ink itself, absorbed through the skin of the fingertips and the mucous membranes of the eyes, odorless, tasteless, cumulative. And it did not cause visions, precisely. It caused doubt. It caused the slow, insidious erosion of the boundary between what had happened and what felt as though it had. By the 3rd letter, each one colder, more contemptuous than the last, Gracie had begun to wonder if she had ever truly known Charles Edward at all. If the memory of his voice, the particular quality of his attention at the winter ball, the way he had looked at her as though she were a problem he wanted very much to solve, if any of it had been real, or if she had constructed it from loneliness and need and the desperate human hunger to be seen. She sat on the cot in the vault that had no clock, and she pressed the letter to her chest, and she cried for the first time since the door had been sealed. It was exactly what Dorothea had planned for. The William estate was dressed for celebration. Lanterns lined the gravel drive in long amber rows. The upper windows blazed with candlelight. From the garden, the sound of a string quartet drifted through the night air, civilized and beautiful and entirely at odds with what Charles Edward knew was happening beneath the floorboards of the wine cellar. He stood in the shadow of the elm tree at the eastern wall and watched the guests arrive, the silk and the jewels, the practiced laughter, the carriages rolling to a stop with the smooth efficiency of a society that had learned to perform happiness as a form of currency. And he felt something cold and precise move through him. He had attended 3 of Dorothea Williams' previous functions in the past year, and he had stood in her drawing rooms and drunk her wine, and listened to her speak of charity and philanthropy, and the particular loneliness of widowhood. And he had noticed nothing. He had been invited to be a witness, he understood now, a respectable and titled witness to the performance of a woman who needed the right people to believe her story. He had believed it,
because he had not looked closely enough. He would not make that error again. He had spent 3 weeks preparing, not recklessly, methodically, with the same controlled patience he brought to everything that mattered to him. He had bribed a footman for the layout of the lower floors. He had obtained the architect's original survey of the estate's cellar system from the county records office through a series of intermediaries who did not know each other's names. But he had confirmed the location of the service corridor behind the wine racks, the depth of the vault, the placement of the hatch. He waited until the ball was at its height, until the noise above was sufficient to absorb what was necessary, and then he moved. He entered through the servants' entrance at the back of the house, dressed in plain, dark wool, no cravat, no insignia. He moved through the kitchen passage with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who belonged wherever he happened to be, descended the cellar stairs without a candle, and navigated the cold dark by the map he had memorized. The wine racks rose on either side of him, floor to ceiling. The smell was earth and oak, and the particular damp cold of a place built to keep things preserved. The vault door was sealed with iron and weld. He had known it would be. He had not come unprepared. The charge was small, shaped, and would make a sound that could, if he had timed it correctly, be absorbed into the percussive flourish of the quartet's current movement. He set it. He stepped back. He covered his ears. The door came apart. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt physical. He waited 3 heartbeats, then moved forward, through the smoke and the settling debris into the vault. The lamp he carried threw a thin circle of amber light across stone floor, stone walls, a small table, a cot. She was in the corner, pressed against the far wall with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, her dark curls fallen loose from whatever arrangement they had been in, and her eyes open and fixed on him with an expression that was not fear exactly, but something older than fear. The look of a person who has been startled so many times they have stopped flinching and have arrived instead at a kind of terrible stillness. She was slight and brown-skinned, the warm, deep brown of a woman made for sunlight, and the vault had given her none. She wore a dress that had once been white and was now the color of old linen. Her lower lip was cut. One of her hands, he noticed, was wrapped in torn fabric, a makeshift bandage over a wound that had not been allowed to heal properly. She stared at him. He stared at her. "Gracie William," he said. It was not a question. And then the girl in the corner screamed, not with terror, with fury. She pushed herself upright against the wall and pointed at him with the wrapped hand.
And her voice, when it came, was clear and hard and utterly without uncertainty. "Get away from me! Get away! You don't know what you've done. Coming here, you've ruined everything. She told me you would come. She told me exactly what you would say. Stop." Charles kept his voice level. He did not move toward her. He held the lamp at chest height and stood very still, because he understood instinctively that sudden movement would not help either of them. The girl stopped. She breathed. She looked at him with dark, exhausted eyes and said, very quietly and with devastating precision, "I am Gracie William. My father's Sir Thomas William. I have been in this vault for 11 weeks, and the woman you have been corresponding with, the woman at the winter ball who told you she was me, she is not Gracie William."
She was put in my life by Dorothea 6 months before my father drowned, to watch us, to watch me. And whatever she told you, it was what she was paid to say. The lamp flame wavered between them. Charles looked at the girl against the wall, at the wound on her hand, at the careful anger in her eyes, at the way she held herself upright, by force of will alone after 11 weeks in a sound-proofed vault, and felt something shift in him that had no clean name. He reached into his coat. He withdrew the blood letter. The original, folded and refolded, the linen worn soft at the creases. He held it up. She looked at it. Her breath caught. "I found this," he said, "in the wheel housing of my carriage." It was written in blood. The man who delivered it to me was shot dead on my study floor within minutes of my reading it, and I have been evading a murder charge for 3 weeks in order to stand in this vault. He paused. "So before either of us says anything else, tell me something only the woman who wrote this letter would know." The girl looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she said, "The last line." "I didn't write last line in linen. I ran out of space. I finished it on the underside of the floorboard itself. If you pried up the board in the coal passage, board 3, counting from the hatch, you would find the last 4 words." Charles had pried up that board. He had stood in the coal passage with a lamp and a knife and found the 4 words carved into the wood with a glass shard in letters so small they were nearly invisible. He had not told anyone about those words.
They were not in any version of the letter that had passed through any other hands. He lowered the lamp. He looked at the girl against the wall, at Gracie William, who had written her name in her own blood and hidden the last line of her plea in a place only she would have known to put it. And he felt something he had spent a long time refusing to feel. The absolute, unwelcome, undeniable recognition of a person he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking. He lowered his gun. "We need to leave this vault," he said, "right now, and you're going to tell me everything on the way." They did not leave immediately. Gracie could not stand without assistance, and she would not ask for it. Not yet, not from a man she had met 11 seconds ago in the wreckage of a door he had blown open without asking her permission. She gripped the wall with one hand and breathed until her legs remembered what they were for, and Charles Edward, Duke of Stirling, stood 2 feet away with the lamp and did not offer his hand and did not comment on the delay, which was precisely the right thing to do and which she noted without speaking. "There is something in the wall," she said when her legs held. He looked at her. "Before we go," she crossed to the far corner of the vault, the corner she had spent 11 weeks mapping by touch in the dark, pressing her palms against stone until she found the one seam that was not quite right. The one brick whose mortar was softer than its neighbours, whose edge gave slightly under pressure. "I found it in the 4th week. I didn't know what it was. I thought it might be a hiding place for wine inventory, such as something the cellar staff used." She pressed against the brick. It shifted. She worked it free with both hands, the wound on her palm pulling tight with the effort, and set it aside. Behind it lay a narrow recess, deep as her forearm, lined in oilcloth. Inside, a journal. Leather-bound, dark burgundy, worn at the spine. She had recognized the binding the moment her fingers found it. She had given it to her father herself 3 Christmases ago from a stationer on Bond Street. He had carried it everywhere. He had written in it every morning at the study desk before anyone else was awake, and she had always known better than to ask what he wrote in it, because it was the one private thing her father kept, and she had loved him enough to let him keep it. She held it out to Charles without opening it. He took it. He opened it. He read. Gracie watched his face. She had nothing else to do and nowhere else to look, and she had learned in 11 weeks to read people through very small signals, the quality of their stillness, the movement at the corner of a jaw,
the way breathing changed when something surprised a person who was trying not to be surprised. Charles Edward read with his jaw set and his eyes moving quickly, and then they stopped moving, and for a moment he was entirely motionless. Then he turned several pages at once, as though he needed to confirm something he had just read, and his hand on the journal tightened. "Read this," he said. He did not specify the passage. He turned the journal and held it toward the lamp so she could see. Gracie took the journal. She found the page where his fingers had rested and began to read her father's handwriting. Cramped and slightly slanted, the hand of a man who wrote faster than he wanted to, and the vault seemed to contract around her as she read. Sir Thomas William had not drowned, or rather, he had been in the water. He had arranged for the appearance of drowning with the help of two men whose names filled a full page of the journal, men whose positions in the government were listed with the flat precision of a person recording facts they wished they did not know. He had staged his death. He had done it knowing that Dorothea would move against Gracie once his protection was removed, and he had done it anyway. He had done it, the journal explained in his own meticulous hand, because Gracie's survival required his disappearance. So because the alternative, allowing Gracie to remain visible and known and traceable, would bring something far worse than Dorothea to her door. She read the word that explained why. She read it twice. It was a single sentence, written in the careful hand of a man choosing his words with surgical precision. Gracie carries in her blood the proof of a lineage that, if authenticated, would dissolve the current claim to the throne and reduce 3 decades of succession to illegitimacy. The journal fell quiet in her hands. She was aware of her own heartbeat. She was aware of Charles, standing 2 feet away, watching her with those storm-grey eyes that had not looked away from her face since she had begun reading. But she was aware of the lamp flame between them and the particular quality of the silence, the kind of silence that falls after something irrevocable has been said. "He hid me," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of this. "He put me in this vault. He allowed this, because he thought it would protect me." "Yes," Charles said. He decided alone that the best way to keep his daughter safe was to let her stepmother imprison her in a soundproofed basement for an undetermined number of weeks while he disappeared and left her with no explanation and no recourse. She paused, and he wrote this all down in a journal and hid it behind a brick in the vault he put her in. Charles said nothing. There was, Gracie thought, nothing to say. She closed the journal. She held it for a moment. The worn leather, the familiar weight of it in her hands, the smell of her father's study that still clung faintly to the binding. And she felt the grief move through her like a cold current. Not grief for a dead man. Grief for the father she had believed she had. The man of loud laughter and fierce love, the man who called her bright as morning. He was alive somewhere. He had chosen to leave her here. And he had done it. In his own estimation, out of love. She did not know yet whether she could forgive this. She was not certain she wanted to try. "The syndicate Dorothea owes money to," Charles said quietly. "They know what she knows, they know what you are." He paused. "Which means this vault is not the only danger." Gracie looked up at him. In the amber light of the lamp, with the smoke from the blown door still faintly in the air, while he looked like exactly what he was, a man standing at the point where duty and something more personal had collided, who had not yet decided which one would win. She noticed the steadiness of his hands. She noticed the letter in his coat pocket. She could see the edge of the linen where it pressed against the fabric. He had kept it against his body. She realized he had carried her words against his chest. She did not examine what that meant, not now. "Then we don't have time to stand here," she said. She tucked her father's journal inside her dress against her ribs, where the warmth of her body closed around it. She looked at the vault door. The destroyed vault door, the blasted iron hanging in its frame, and she looked at the dark corridor beyond it, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, exactly. Something harder than hope. Something that had been quietly building in the dark for 11 weeks and had finally, with the particular violence of compressed things, found room to expand. She stepped through the door. Charles lifted the lamp and followed, close enough that the warmth of him was just perceptible at her shoulder. Not touching, not presuming, but present. Available. A man who understood, she thought, the difference between accompanying someone and crowding them. Above them, through the cellar ceiling, she could hear the faint music of the ball still playing. She had been erased from this house. Her portrait removed, her name crossed off invitations, her existence reduced to a rumor about instability and seas she had never seen. She was walking through it now with her father's secrets pressed against her heart and a duke at her shoulder, and Dorothea Williams' elaborate architecture of lies was about to discover that the woman it had been built to contain had spent 11 weeks in the dark, getting very, very ready. She was already there. Dorothea Williams stood at the far end of the service corridor with a lamp of her own, dressed in deep burgundy silk that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, and she looked at Charles and Gracie with the composed, unsurprised expression of a woman who had anticipated this particular evening for quite some time. She was not alarmed, she was not reaching for the door. She stood with her hands folded at her waist and her chin level, and she looked at her stepdaughter, at Gracie, who had stopped moving the moment she saw her, who had gone very still in the corridor with her jaw set and her dark eyes burning. And something moved across Dorothea's face that was too complex to name in a single word. "I wondered which one of them it would be," Dorothea said. Her voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a woman in full command of a room she had chosen. Her gaze moved to Charles. "I hoped it wouldn't be you." "Step aside," Charles said. "I will not." She did not move. She looked at Gracie the way she had always looked at her, with that particular layered intensity that Gracie had spent her entire life misreading as contempt. "You need to hear what I have to say before you leave this house with this man. Because if you leave with him not knowing what he is, and I will have done everything I have done for absolutely nothing." "Everything you have done," Gracie said softly, "includes 6 weeks in a soundproofed vault." 11, Dorothea said. "And yes, it does." The silence in the corridor was complete and terrible. Above them, through the stone and oak and plaster of 3 floors, the string quartet was playing something tender. The contrast was almost obscene. Dorothea spoke before either of them could move. "I am your mother." She said it the way a surgeon makes an incision, with the understanding that it would hurt and the determination that it was necessary. "Not your stepmother, your mother. Thomas William did not marry me after your birth. He married me before it, under a different name in a church in the country that no longer exists. He had the records destroyed because he had to. Yeah, because the alternative was exposing what I was, who I worked for, and what your blood meant. He did what men do when they are frightened of the thing they love. He buried it." Gracie had not moved. The journal was pressed against her ribs, and she could feel its edges with every breath. Her mother's eyes. She had always known she had her mother's eyes because her father had told her so, without ever producing a portrait, without ever producing a name. The syndicate, Dorothea continued, and now her gaze moved to Charles with the flat precision of a woman placing a card face up on a table, has been hunting you since you were born. They know what your blood can prove. They have spent 17 years trying to find a way to access it without drawing attention to what they know. The vault beneath the royal archives requires the authenticated thumbprint of a living heir to the buried line. She paused. Every man who has come to this house in the last 2 years with money and title and the appearance of rescue, every single one of them has been sent by the syndicate. The lamp flame between Charles and Gracie was very small and very steady. She is lying, Charles said. His voice was controlled, entirely controlled. Gracie turned to look at him. She looked at the set of his jaw, at the steadiness of his hands, at the particular quality of his stillness. And she remembered with a cold and clarifying precision the 3 weeks it had taken him to come. The carriage smith, dead on his study floor within minutes of the letter's delivery, the constable who had arrived too fast. The murder charge that had been engineered with the specific goal of ensuring that whatever Charles Edward did next, he would do it under pressure and without the luxury of consultation. She looked at her mother, at Dorothea, who had locked her in a vault and was now standing in a corridor asking to be trusted. She looked at Charles, who had blown the vault door and was now asking the same thing. "Which one of you," she said very quietly, "is telling the truth?" Neither of them answered immediately. The space between the three of them held the particular tension of a room with 3 loaded weapons and no clear target, and Gracie Williams stood at its center in a ruined white dress with her father's journal against her heart and the full weight of 17 years of careful deception pressing down on her from every direction at once. Charles took 1 step toward her. She did not step back. She held his gaze. Those storm-grey eyes that had looked at her, she realized with recognition the moment he had seen her. Not the recognition of a man meeting a stranger. Something older, something that had known her face before she had entered the vault. She needed to think. She needed time she did not have. "Move," she said to Dorothea. And her voice, to its credit, did not shake at all. They reached the upper corridor before Charles stopped walking. He stopped so suddenly that Gracie was 2 steps ahead before she registered the absence of him at her shoulder. And she turned to find him standing in the middle of the passage, with his hand pressed flat against the panelled wall and his head slightly bowed. The posture, she thought, of a man recalibrating. Of a man who has decided, in the space between one breath and the next, to stop performing. "Gracie," he said. She waited. He raised his head. The lamp was in his left hand, and the shadows it threw across his face made him look older, or perhaps simply more precisely himself, stripped of the careful composure he wore in company and left with whatever was underneath it. She had thought, in the vault, that his eyes were storm-grey. She revised this now. They were the grey of a sky that had already made its decision about what kind of weather it intended to produce. "What Dorothea told you," he said. "It is not entirely wrong." The corridor held them both. "The syndicate exists," he said. "I know it exists because I have been a part of it, not its head. That distinction belongs to someone I have not yet been permitted to meet face to face. But a part of it, yes. I was brought in 4 years ago, under the pretense of a political investment group. I did not understand the full scope of it until 18 months ago, when I was shown a document that explained what the group actually wanted and what it intended to use to get it." He paused. "Your thumbprint. On the lock of a vault, beneath the exchequer that has been sealed since your great-great-grandmother's time. The document inside that vault, if authenticated, does exactly what your father's journal says it does. Gracie's jaw was tight. Her hands were loose at her sides, deliberately loose, the way she had kept them in the vault when she needed to think without letting her body betray the thinking. "And when you found the blood letter," she said, "when you read it, well, was that part of the strategy?" "No." The word was immediate and unadorned. "The letter was, but it was not what I expected. I had been told you were compliant, that you had accepted your situation. What I read was a woman who was fighting with the only weapon she had left, and fighting very well." Something moved in his expression. Not quite apology, not quite grief, but adjacent to both. "I made a choice when I read it. I made it again when I hid the body. I make it again now." "A choice to do what, exactly?" "To not be what they sent me here to be." The words fell into the quiet of the corridor and did not echo, because old houses absorbed sound the way they absorbed everything else, slowly and without giving it back. Gracie looked at him. She looked at the letter, still in his coat pocket. The edge of worn linen still visible against the dark wool. She looked at his hands, the left holding the lamp steady, the right at his side, open. Not reaching, not demanding, open. She was still deciding what to do with all of this when Mary appeared at the end of the corridor. Mary, who had brought food to the vault hatch each morning with downcast eyes, and had once, pressed her fingers briefly over Gracie's on the edge of the tray in what Gracie had read as sympathy. Mary, who was small and quick and had a talent for moving through a house without being noticed, that Gracie had attributed to years of domestic service. Mary, who was carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea and wearing an expression that was nothing at all like the Mary who had served the vault. "I thought you might need something warm," Mary said. After all that?" Gracie looked at the tea. She looked at Mary's hands, steady, offered forward, no hesitation. And she thought about the letters. The fabricated letters in Charles's handwriting, the ones that had been passed through the food hatch. The letters that had required someone inside the house who understood the timing, who knew when Dorothea was visiting the vault and when she was not. Who could move between floors without explanation? "Who do you work for?" Gracie asked. Mary set the tray on the hall table. She straightened, and the woman who looked back at Gracie was not the maid who had brought breakfast trays. She was someone entirely other, measured, direct, wearing her competence openly now that there was no longer any reason to hide it. "And a faction that wants the vault opened for different reasons than the syndicate does," she said. "Reasons that do not involve consolidating power. Reasons that would, in fact, distribute it." She glanced at Charles. "I have been watching you for longer than you know, and I need both of you incapacitated long enough for me to take the journal and the girl to someone who can be trusted with both." The tea was already poured. Gracie felt the warmth of the cups from 2 feet away and understood, with the terrible clarity of a woman who had learned in 11 weeks to treat every offered comfort as a potential weapon, exactly what the warmth meant. She looked at Charles. He looked at her. In the half-second of eye contact between them, something was communicated that required no words and used no language that either of them could have named, only the shared recognition of 2 people who had each, independently and for different reasons, just arrived at the same conclusion. Neither of them touched the tea. Mary's expression shifted. The first crack in her composure, small but real. "It would have been easier if you'd—" "Yes," Charles said. "It would." He moved left, Gracie moved right. And Mary, for all her training, had prepared for compliance and had not adequately prepared for this. The morning room was warm. Someone had lit the fire. Recently, the cold still catching, but the room still climbing toward comfort, and the early light through the tall east-facing windows lay across the floorboards in long golden planes that had nothing to do with what was about to happen in them. Gracie stood at the window in the blue gown Dorothea had sent down 3 days ago, the one she had put on without thinking, and now could not take off because there was nothing else. The silk was the deep, clean blue of a winter sky an hour before dark. Against her brown skin it was striking in the way that beautiful things sometimes are when placed in terrible situations, more vivid for the contrast, harder to look away from. She had the journal. She had the original blood letter, retrieved from Charles's coat in the corridor during the confusion with Mary. She had placed both inside the gown's inner seam against her body, which was the only place in this house that had proven reliably safe. She was waiting because there was nothing else to do but wait. Charles had gone to retrieve something from the carriage. Documents, he had said, evidence that would support the journal's claims when they reached the right authorities. He had been gone 11 minutes, she had counted. The door opened at minute 12. He entered the way Charles always entered a room, with that unhurried, measured quality, the Duke's bearing that was less arrogance than precision, a man who moved through space as though he had calculated his trajectory in advance. He wore the same dark coat. His cravat was correctly tied. He carried a folded letter, cream paper, dark wax seal, and he held it toward her with an expression of quiet solemnity as he crossed the room. "Oh, I found this in the carriage, Ma," he said. "Sabatettin, it concerns you. I think you should read it before we go." Gracie took the letter. She looked at it without opening it. At the seal, at the handwriting on the front, at the particular way the paper had been folded. Charles had shown her the original blood letter in the vault, had held it up in the lamplight, had let her see how it had been carried against his body until the linen was worn soft at the creases. This paper was crisp. The wax was unbroken and freshly pressed. She looked up at him. He stood 3 feet away in the golden morning light, with his hands at his sides and his expression composed and patient. And something in the room's atmosphere was wrong in the specific way that wrongness announces itself not through any single detail but through the accumulation of many very small ones. At the fire behind him, the quality of his stillness, the way his eyes, she looked at his eyes, were watching her with an attention that was calibrated rather than felt. Charles's eyes in the vault and in the corridor and in every moment of the past hours had been the eyes of a man in the middle of something, conflicted, present, slightly undone by the specific gravity of her. These eyes were not that. These eyes were the eyes of a man watching a task approach its completion. She held the letter in both hands. She breathed once, slowly, and she said the word. It was not a dramatic word. It was the kind of word that meant nothing to anyone who had not been present for a specific conversation on a specific night 3 years ago in the conservatory of the Alderton house during the winter ball. But when a young woman with warm brown skin and a laugh she had not been able to suppress had collided with a duke who was trying to avoid a particular duchess, and they had stood in the dark among the orange trees and talked for 40 minutes about everything that mattered and nothing that was safe. And at the end of it he had said, very quietly, that if he ever needed to know whether someone was truly who they claimed to be, he would ask for this word, and she had given it to him without hesitation, because she had trusted him in the way that people sometimes trust strangers who feel inexplicably known. She said it now, quietly, into the morning light. The man across the room looked at her. He did not react. Not the small involuntary softening she would have expected, not the recognition. not the imperceptible shift in his posture that would have meant he remembered. He looked at her with those calibrated eyes, and he waited for her to finish whatever she was doing so that she could return to the task he had come here to complete. The letter fell from her hands, not because she dropped it, because her hands had simply stopped participating in the pretense, and the paper drifted to the floor between them and lay there in the morning light, and Gracie William looked at the man wearing Charles Edward's face and wearing Charles Edward's coat and carrying himself with Charles Edward's bearing, and she understood with the cold, terrible completeness of a woman who had survived 11 weeks underground by refusing to be deceived, that Charles Edward was not in this room, had not been in this room since before the corridor. Oh, perhaps since before the ball? Where is Etienne? She said. It was not a question. The man across the room, the man who shared Charles's jaw and Charles's height and Charles's grey eyes, who had grown up in the same house and learned the same walk and the same composure and had needed only a few weeks to acquire the rest, smiled. It was a small smile, patient, almost kind. "Further away than you can reach him," he said, "and closer than is comfortable for either of you." Behind her, through the tall east windows, the first pale thread of smoke was beginning to rise from the wing of the house that contained the wine cellar. Dorothea, it seemed, had made her decision. The smoke reached the morning room before the fire did. It came under the door first, thin, exploratory.
The pale grey of something, still deciding whether to commit. And then through the wall scenes, and then suddenly and everywhere at once, because old houses do not burn slowly once they decide to burn. They burn with the conviction of things that have been holding themselves together by obligation for a very long time and have finally been given permission to let go. The man wearing Charles's face moved toward her. He was not panicking. This, she noted, meant the fire was not a surprise to him, which meant he had either set it himself or had been informed it would be set, which meant that whatever Dorothea thought she was destroying with the blaze, this man believed it would not include him. He was wrong about Gracie. He had perhaps been wrong about a number of things. She did not wait for him to reach her. She moved left, toward the writing desk in the corner, the desk she had noticed when she entered the room, because she noticed every desk in every room now reflexively, the way a person who has spent weeks unable to write notices every available surface. The inkwell was there, the pen, and beneath the pen, held flat by its weight, a single sheet of cream writing paper. She had perhaps 4 minutes before the smoke made the room untenable. She used the first 30 seconds of them to pull the journal from her dress and open it to the page her father had written with the names. The full names, the positions, the dates. She used the next 2 minutes to write in compressed, precise strokes the summary that the journal's length would not allow a burning house to deliver: the syndicate, its members, its purpose, its methods, the vault, the bloodline. I saw the dead carriage smith, the fabricated murder charge, the poisoned letters, the twin who had taken a dukedom by killing its rightful holder. She signed it, Gracie William, daughter of Sir Thomas William, witnessed against my will and in full possession of my faculties this morning in the morning room of William Manor, which is currently on fire. The man reached for her wrist. She moved before his fingers closed, not away, but through, using the momentum of his reach to turn past him and put the desk between them. She was not strong enough to fight him directly, and she had no interest in discovering whether she was wrong about this. She had the letter. She had the journal. She needed a window and a clear path to the drive. "There is no one coming for you," he said. His voice was still composed. She found this more unsettling than anger would have been. "Whatever story you are constructing in your head, the authorities in this county are on Dorothea's payroll," she said. "Yes, I know." She reached the window. The latch gave under her hands. The morning air came in cold and clean, and
She breathed it like something sacred. Below, the gravel drive was empty. The ball's guests had apparently been given reason to leave. The fire, or something before the fire. Beyond the drive, the elm tree stood at the eastern wall, its upper branches just visible. And beyond the elm tree, the road that led away from William Manor in the direction of the city and the offices of men whose payrolls Dorothea had not been able to reach. She heard, from somewhere in the house, from deep beneath it, from the wine cellar or the coal passage or the place where the vault had been, a sound that might have been a door or a man moving through the dark by the map he had memorized, or both. She did not let herself hope. Not yet. She looked at the man across the room. She thought about the father who had staged his death and written a journal and hidden it in the vault with her because he had believed, in his frightened and misguided love, that the most important thing was to keep the secret safe rather than to keep his daughter informed. She thought about whether she would go back for him. She turned this over carefully the way she had turned everything over in the vault, with patience and without sentiment, examining it from every angle until it showed her its true shape. The answer was no, not because she did not love him, and because loving someone did not obligate her to step back into a burning house for a man who had made his choices and left her to make hers without the information she needed to make them well. If he was alive, and she believed now that he was capable of leaving under his own authority. He had proven himself capable of a great many things she had not given him credit for. She dropped the letter from the window. It caught the morning air and drifted, turning once, and settled on the gravel of the drive where it could be found by anyone approaching the house, which, given the smoke now visible from the road, would be someone, soon. The journal she kept. The journal was evidence, and evidence required a chain of custody. And she was the chain. She climbed out of the window. She climbed out. The drop was 8 feet to the portico roof and another 6 to the gravel below, and she made both of them without grace, but also without damage, landing hard on her feet with the blue silk of her gown coming loose at one shoulder seam and her hair entirely undone and her hands stinging from the stone. She stood. She breathed. She looked back at the house, at the smoke thickening in the upper windows, at the morning room where the man wearing the wrong face stood watching her from behind the glass with an expression that had finally, in the end, shown her something genuine. Not fury, something that looked very much like reluctant admiration. She turned away from it. She had taken 4 steps down the drive when she heard the side door open behind her. She did not stop walking, but she listened. She heard footsteps. One pair, steady, unhurried, with the particular cadence of a man who had been moving through a burning house in the dark and had not been stopped by it. She heard the footsteps reach the gravel. She heard them, after a moment's pause, begin to close the distance between themselves and her. She stopped. She turned. He looked as though the past several hours had made serious attempts on his composure and had not entirely failed. His coat was gone, his cravat was gone. There was ash on his jaw and something dark at his temple that she chose not to examine too closely. And his grey eyes, these were his grey eyes, she knew them from the inside now. She knew the difference in an immediate and physical way she did not try to articulate, were looking at her with the specific, undone quality of a man who has just come through something that removed several of his carefully maintained defenses and has not yet decided whether to rebuild them. He had the letter, the blood letter, the original linen, which he had apparently retrieved from wherever his brother had taken it. He held it up, not offering it, not explaining it, simply showing her that he had it, that he had come back for it, that he understood what it was. Behind them, William Manor burned. Gracie William looked at Charles Edward, Duke of Stirling, standing in the morning light on the gravel drive of the estate where she had been erased and unmade and written back into existence by her own hand, and she felt the full weight of everything she had survived press against her chest like a held breath that was finally, with enormous and earned relief, being released. She did not say anything. Neither did he. She took the letter from his hand. He let her take it. Their fingers were close, not touching, almost touching, the fraction of an inch between them charged with everything that had happened, and everything that had not yet happened, and everything that would require more than this morning to begin to understand. She folded the letter. She placed it inside the journal. She tucked the journal against her heart, where it had been since the vault, and she turned toward the road. He fell into step beside her. Not behind her, not ahead of her. Beside, one step matching hers, matching, and the morning opened before them with the particular quality of a thing that has not yet been decided, dangerous and possible, empty and full, already and not yet. If you have stayed with Gracie through the darkness of this vault and the fire of this morning and the long, careful work of a woman refusing to be unmade, then you already know that this is not the end of her story. It is only the end of the part that happened underground. What comes next is hers to write. And she has, as we have seen, a gift for writing in the most difficult of circumstances. Subscribe and stay with her. Would you have saved the father who caged you? Or would you have walked into the light and let him make his own way home? Leave your answer below. Some questions, like some letters, deserve to be answered honestly.